Hi everyone, my name is Zach, and in this video we will pose the creature. For this we will use a special technique by creating a mesh which is covering all the parts of the creature. Then using a mesh deform modifier we will bind all the parts of the creature to this mesh, and after this we will deform this special mesh using an armature system. And if you ask yourself why we don't just use an armature system without this whole mesh deform modifier stuff, well, watch the video. Keep in mind that you only pose this creature when you want to have a static figure at the end. But if you want to use this for production later on, keep this in this kind of T-pose, this symmetrical pose, which is then certainly much easier to retopologize, texture, rig, and so on. Alright, without further words, let's get started. Okay, finally we want to pose this creature. So one way would certainly be just put in an armature in there, use with automatic weights to bind the mesh to the armature and then just pose it. But we will not use this directly because if we have all these objects sticking onto our main body and then just simply use an armature modifier, it can happen that the position of the scales on the surface are changing so that they are peeking through or clipping through the mesh somehow in a way that we don't like it. And to pose an object with many different objects attached, there we should use the mesh deform modifier, because in this way you can deform pretty complex objects with different parts and then they will all maintain the position. So for this we need a, let's call it cage object, basically a bigger object which is covering the whole mesh, something like this. And yeah, let's build this quickly. Okay, for this we press Shift C to recenter our 3D cursor, Shift A add a cube, and on this cube with Ctrl 1 I add a subsurf modifier with one subdivision. And now I create a shape which is looking pretty similar like the creature, but the original mesh from the creature is inside the volume of this mesh. So basic edit mode modeling. Take care that this button down here is disabled so we can select vertices which are on the other side. And now we move, scale, and with E or Control left click, we extrude the vertices. Okay, let's quickly do this. So, and since I will also include the legs, I will add a loop cut in the center, delete one side, and then I add the mirror modifier. This one I move up in the modifier stack and enable clipping. So I deleted the part of the leg again because it's extremely important that this new mesh we are building is covering everything completely so that no scale, no nothing is peeking through the mesh. So in this space between the legs and the body is quite small. So I will increase the mesh here. That means I will extrude this whole area for the upper leg. So because the upper leg we don't move that much around, I guess. So the shape looks quite edgy at the moment. So let's select everything, hit space and search for a smooth vertex. And then we can repeat this to smooth this whole new shape. Certainly now a lot of things are peeking through. For this I press Alt S for the shrink fatten function to make this thicker. And now let's adjust some of the parts manually. So let's quickly make a test. I add a new material. Under settings down here, the viewport color, I switch to another color. And then we should see it pretty well if something is peeking through, like back here. But the rest looks fine, I would say. Let's call this thing Creature Mesh Deform. And let's go over to the Object, Display, and under Maximum Draw Type, let's set this to Wire, so we can look through this thing. Also, you should take care that the distance from the new mesh and the original mesh is not too big, so that the deformation will look nice at the end. Okay, now we should apply the modifier, the mirror and the subsurf, and don't put the subdivisions too high, we don't need that. One subdivision is more than enough. And now we want to bind our original mesh to this mesh deform object. For this, I select the main body, add a mesh deform modifier, and now very important, move this up so that this modifier will be calculated first. That means we only deform the low-res version of this sculpting here. And after we've deformed it, then we will enable this down here, and then we have the high resolution. That means since we are moving the low-res around, it's much smoother than we would bind this to the high resolution sculpting. So here we choose the mesh deform object. Now we have this precision level, which basically defines how good the deformation should be. And I would put this a little bit higher, but you have to be careful. The higher the level, the longer the binding process takes. And if you just put it to 6 or 7, this already increases the binding process a lot. So take care. In my case, I put this up to 7. And then we hit bind, and then these two objects will be bind together. And the same thing we need to do for the scales, jawbone, horns, and the eyes, basically for all the objects which are related to this creature. So every object should have the same precision level. I will quickly do this for all the objects, and since this will take a short while, I'll skip this process. Alright, here I'm back, and now everything is put together. Now let's take the mesh deform object, quickly switch to edit mode, and just for testing purpose, select the head, enable proportional editing, and now let's just rotate the head, and you will see what happens here. Although, as you can see, it's still a little bit laggy, but this is way better than if you would bind this high resolution object with multiple million polygons onto this mesh deform object. So, and as you can see, all the scales are staying exactly in place where they should be. Certainly they will be deformed a bit, but that should not be the problem. So, but as you can guess, if we now transform this in edit mode manually, then certainly we also changing the proportions of the whole thing. So this is not what we will do. And to better deform this mesh deform object is to use an armature system. For this, we will quickly add some bones here. So I press Shift C to recenter our 3D cursor, Shift A, armature, single bone. Down here under display, let's enable X-ray so we can see it inside the body. Switch to edit mode, select the tail. The small end is the tail and the big end is the head. Let's select this one. And with E, we can extrude it. So let's extrude a few. One for the head. Then let's go in the other direction. We can simply go to the end, select this one, press W, subdivide, and then increase the number of cuts here. Okay, now let's left click here to position the 3D cursor, press Shift A to add a new bone. And now let's quickly enable snapping for volume, and here we set median. Also let's hide the mesh deform object. And if I now move this around, it will detect basically one face and the next, and will put our bone exactly in the center of these two. So it's much quicker to add some bones here. Yeah, something like this. Disable the snapping, move this in a bit. And now we want to copy this one leg to the other side. So Shift D to duplicate this, right click, then it jumps back to this original position. Shift C for recentering the cursor. Down here under pivot point, let's switch to 3D cursor. And now let's hit Ctrl M for the mirroring function, and then X for the X axis, and then enter. Yeah, and that's basically all we need here. And this armature skeleton we don't use to deform the high resolution mesh directly, we just deform the mesh deform object. So let's select the mesh deform object. After this, the armature with Shift, so both are selected. Then press Ctrl P, set parent to armature deform with automatic weights. Yeah, and that's it basically. Now we can select the armature, switch to pose mode. And if I now select one bone and down here, let's switch back to median point and rotate it, you can see I now can move the bones. The bones will move the deform object, and the deform object will deform our sculpting. So, and this is definitely the best workflow to deform very high resolution objects. So, and now I'm changing the position of this creature to something like this here. So there's only one thing that I've noticed. I have no idea why this is this way, but if I bind all this stuff, the Blender file will be extremely big after the binding process. I have no idea what Blender is doing in the background, but this Ben file here now is going up from 600 megabytes to 2.7 gigabytes, which is pretty big. So I will save this file as backup, but after I've posed the creature in the way I would like to have it, then I will apply all the modifiers so my blend file will not be that big at the end. Okay, now basically to make this a bit quicker, let's move the armature and mesh deform object to a separate layer. Let's hide the mesh deform object so we only can see the armature. And if I now only enable the creature without the scales, I can pose this a bit quicker. Okay, now I'm nearly done, but let's adjust a few things. Let's select the mesh deform object. Since we have created this armature object and bind those two things together, this armature modifier was automatically created. And here we have this nice option, preserve volume. Especially in the areas where we bend the object, you can see this very strong deformation. So let's click this button and you can see how this tries to fix these areas a bit. So, and there's also a nice feature. I don't have added an IK to this leg, for example, and I don't want to do this because this is extra work and we just want to pose this to a static pose and don't want to animate this. But there's a nice option. If I select this bone here, for example, I can simply enable auto IK under options, and then it will automatically generate an IK for us without adding any constraints or anything. So as you can see, now I can move the leg like I would have an IK, and this makes this much quicker to, for example, just move the leg a bit to the back here. And this one maybe a little bit forward. So something like this. Now we have another small problem. If I disable this two objects here, you can see that the head is a bit deformed. It's not perfectly the original shape anymore. And that's because the bone of the head is not deforming 100% of this area up here. But we can quickly fix that. First of all, make sure that you are in pose mode of this armature system. Then right click, select the object which is deformed by the armature. And then we can switch to weight pane mode. And here you can see how strong one bone is deforming the mesh. And if the area is red, then this means it will be deformed 100%. And then you can see this transition to orange, yellow, green, light blue, and dark blue. And dark blue means no deformation. So the colors in between are lower values. And you can see that down here we have this yellow-orange area. That means this area is not deformed by this bone 100%. So let's go to the tools and click on Auto Normalize. That means if I now change this weight here, it will be automatically adjusted according to the other bones so that no area has no deformation. So let's increase the weight to 1 here. It's a standard setting. And now let's paint over this area. And now you can see how this is changing. So because I just want to have a 100% deformation on the head. So let's check this out. And as you can see now, this is perfectly straight again. If I now enable the scales, you will see that the scales are not deformed correctly, but this is no problem. Simply disable the mesh deform and re-enable this, and then everything is as it should be. So now comes the cool part. After we've deformed the creature, we can select the body, for example, and simply enable the multi-res modifier. And since the mesh deform will be calculated first and the multi-res afterwards, you will see that we have all the details on the deformed mesh. So how cool is that? Same thing applies to the scales. Easy peasy. Okay, not really, but it works. Okay, since I don't want to have my blend files to be that big, I will now apply the modifiers. For this, I go to the creature and apply the mesh deform. And also I will apply all the mesh deform modifiers of all the other objects. But yeah, let's quickly skip that. Okay, I'm through. And now basically we can delete the mesh deform object and also the armature for this. Yeah, and now my blend file is also back at the normal size, but I have a backup of this mesh deformed object. So if I need, I can go back to this file, change the pose of this creature a bit, and then replace this in my latest version. But yeah, I think I will leave the pose as it is here.